I'm here today in Detroit with Michigan's longest-serving United States Senator and the chair of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School, Senator Carl Levin. My name is Jocelyn Benson, and I am the dean of the law school. And Senator Levin has had a long and distinguished career in Congress, but one of the areas of accomplishment he's most noted for is his work on congressional oversight and investigations. And it's in large part because of that work that the Levin Center is dedicated to strengthening bipartisan, in-depth, fact-based legislative oversight modeled after the Levin years. So today we'd like to talk with you, Senator Levin, about how you got started with oversight and why you think it's so important. Now, you began your career as an elected official in Detroit on the city council, eventually becoming council president, and I was wondering if you could start by talking about opportunities for the city council to conduct oversight, and especially ones that you participated in.
Well, we had a great chance to do oversight when I was city council president. We had a major federal fiasco in Detroit, which was the housing program, which was intended, of course, to produce or to help to produce housing which would be more affordable. But a lot of that housing during a downturn became abandoned, and HUD then became the effective owner of about 10,000 houses in Detroit. We have an ordinance we did then, and we still do, which says that if you own a place which isn't occupied, you've got to board it up, keep it closed to trespassers. Otherwise, they become drug havens and worse. And HUD said that they were not bound by our ordinance, and that we had no right to order them to tear down property or to actually tear it down ourselves if they didn't maintain the property closed. And so we had a battle with them on that issue, because our neighborhoods were then and still are just full of these abandoned houses. It was even a bigger problem then than it is now, because there's been a lot of federal activity, federal funding, and other efforts on the part of the city council and the mayor to remove these houses. So we actually HUD said that we couldn't tear their houses down, even though they were abandoned and open, and we said we could. And one day I went out there with a city contracted bulldozer, and I wasn't the driver. I was the guy who pointed to the house and said, tear that house down. And HUD said, you can't do that, because they may even indict me. And I said, are you kidding? You're not going to indict me. If you took this to a jury, the jury's going to convict HUD, not me. But it was a big issue because it involved a program which I believed in. And that's really the point. And that's it's critically important that people understand that the programs that you support have got to work, not just in theory, not just having funding for them. They've got to actually work, or else you might as well not even have them.
That's good words of advice. Any other words of wisdom for local officials about conducting oversight at the local level?
Well, in general, when you do oversight, you've got to take the time to really know the issue, whatever the issue is. It could be potholes, whatever the issue is, you got to know it. And then you've got to call the official, the local agency head or the bureaucrat in front of the city council, for instance, or a county commission, whatever it is. And you better know your stuff, because otherwise the witness will try to bamboozle you, or usually, not always, but try to evade the question or not take responsibility. So you've got to learn the facts. You've got to listen. You got to really learn to listen. And a lot of people don't in normal conversation, but they also, and too many of these oversight hearings I've noticed, where colleagues even just don't listen to the answers. If they did, they'd realize how evasive the agency person is. And then the third thing you got to do is keep asking the question if the person has evaded the answer. So there's things to learn about oversight, but probably the most important thing is, and this is true at a local level, that you've got to work with your colleagues. Now, there's not a lot of partisan issues in local government, but there are issues where there's different opinions. And so the investigations have got to be nonpartisan, or if it's partisan elections that elect these local officials, they've got to be bipartisan, these investigations. Otherwise, all they are is people throwing mud at each other. We've seen some recent investigations and the Republicans have held in the House of Representatives in Washington, which have been useless and worse. But if you want to accomplish something, if you want to impact policy, they've got to be in-depth and nonpartisan.
And of course, you went to Washington after your time on the City Council. You decided to run for the United States Senate while you were on the City Council. What led to your decision to run for the Senate while on the Council? I'd
say in large measure it was that I had seen too many programs, particularly federal programs, which were not functioning. And these are programs, again, that I support. It's not like I don't support a housing program or an environmental program or a food program, because I do. But unless you take the time and the energy to make sure that those programs are effective, you might as well not have them, because you're going to lose a lot of public support, which you really need for any federal expenditure or any government expenditure. You need the public to support the funding, and otherwise you're doing damage to something you believe in.
Once elected, you and Paul Tsongas spoke to the Americans for Democratic Action about the needs for Democrats to oversee government programs they cared about, just as you were talking about. What were those some of the reasons behind the speech?
They were. Yeah. I really wanted to carry that message to Washington about we have to be accountable for our programs. We can't just vote money program. You've got to be accountable for them, and that means it's another reason you've got to make sure that they work.
Well, it's interesting to the extent that there's been backlash against some of the programs. It's in part because of that the money hasn't necessarily led to results in all cases.
Another thing the federal government is not good at is understanding that there are very major differences between different communities. There's large communities, small communities. There's cities, suburbs, rural areas. There's different kinds of rural areas. You can't have one size that fits all. And that's an important message that I carried to Washington, and I wanted them to understand. I want 20 sizes to meet 20 needs. They all may be an agricultural need or an environmental need. But if you're going to really have an impact, you've got to realize you've got to tailor the program to the local situation. And that is something the federal government was not good at and still is not great at.
Did you find once you got there, though, your colleagues were also receptive to those arguments?
Yeah, because most of us come from different states. And most people don't want a federal bureaucracy to treat the problems of Idaho the same way as they do New York or whatever. And so that same sense is prevalent, I'd say, in a lot of people. But in some cases, it's an anti-government. That wasn't my pitch. My pitch was, these are important programs. They've got to work for the sake of our people. Not that government can't make them work. Government's not the enemy, as President Reagan said, by the way, in his inaugural address, and I was there when he said those words. And I was thinking to myself, my God, government could be the enemy. In many cases it is, because it's wasteful or arrogant. But my God, our government in a democracy, to label our government as the enemy? If you think it's the enemy, then by God, roll up your sleeves, run for office, and make sure it's not the enemy.
Well, once you got to the Senate, you asked to be on the Governmental Affairs Committee because that committee did oversight and investigations. Is that right?
That's right.
And what is the purpose of congressional oversight then at that level, and why is it so important?
To check on excesses, either in the executive branch or at problems in the broader society that are not being addressed properly. To be a check and balance on the executive branch. We all know about checks and balances. We learned when we were in the 6th grade or whenever we start talking about government, about the Constitution, and there being checks and balances. And we always kind of think about, well, the legislative branch can can pass a law, but that can be vetoed by the president. They can, if the law passes and the Supreme Court thinks it's unconstitutional, it can veto a law in effect. So there's checks and balances. We all learn that. But probably the most effective check of them all, of the executive mismanagement, wrongdoing, waste, is oversight by the legislative branch. And we don't do a lot of it, the legislative branch doesn't do a lot of it. It doesn't do it well. And well means it's got to be bipartisan, it's got to be in-depth and it's got to be fact-oriented. It can't be used for partisan purposes, or it just becomes, again, a food fight, and the purpose of it's lost, which is to, again, provide a check on abuse and waste in an executive branch, or, again, where something is going on in society that needs to be addressed. Like one of our early hearings was on credit card abuses, where the credit card companies were bamboozling people by huge interest rates which weren't clearly expressed, and a number of other abuses. And so we had a long investigation of credit card company abuses, and that led to a law being changed which reformed the credit card industry.
When you encountered it, so that's a great example of the oversight power being used in a successful way to change policy to impact people's lives. When you encountered or observed oversight being used in a in a way that doesn't accomplish these goals of good public policy, why is that? In other words, did you observe things about the structure of the legislative process that made it difficult for good oversight to function properly?
Usually when it doesn't function properly, it's because there's a partisan motive behind the investigation. We've seen this recently with a number of investigations that led by the Republicans in the House. One had to do with Benghazi, where they had 20 hearings on the same subject, totally partisan. The Democrats asked for witnesses which were never called. That's not the way to do oversight. You want your staffs, Democratic and Republican, to work together to get the facts. You may have a different opinion at the end of an investigation, but work together, work with Republican colleagues or Democratic colleagues, work across the aisle to agree what is the purpose of the investigation. Let's get the facts and then start with whatever recommendations we have. The other one was on the IRS. They had 20 hearings in the House on what was alleged to be an IRS abuse of the Tea Party. It was just repetitious. It was obviously partisan. They wouldn't let the Democrats have their contribution to the witness list. And when that's the motive, it defeats the purpose of good oversight.
Well, in addition to oversight at the federal level, do you feel it's equally important for state, county, local, tribal governments to also conduct good oversight?
Yeah, any place that there's a legislative branch, whether it's federal, state, county, local, tribal, you need to have people who are willing to devote part of their time to making sure that well-intended programs work at whatever level. That's the check and balance function of the legislative branch. I mean, that is such an inherent part of our government at all levels, the check and balance at all levels. But again, the check is a major part of that check on executive branch activity is a legislative oversight that's aggressive but fair. It's got to be fair. And if you're doing it, if you're motivated by trying to get rid of that president or get rid of that executive official, again, the public will sense it and they'll express their disgust in a number of ways.
Well, it's interesting because I think what struck me also about your ascension to the Senate and your motivation is that it requires some introspection as well to say these policies that we as a entity, as a party, as a group championed may not be functioning properly, and we have to now investigate them. Did you find that type of self-awareness and introspection to be a critical component as well of conducting good oversight, or willingness to challenge your own understanding?
It's very important to do so. It's maybe harder to look in the mirror, but it's important you do so. Otherwise, you're going to miss a lot of opportunities, actually, to correct public policy or get it going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is the type of leadership and the type of approach to good government and oversight that the Levin Center hopes to bring to even more legislators in the future as through our trainings and workshops. So thank you for giving us a little bit of background on how you got to the point that you did, and thank you for your time.
Dean, great to be with you, and thanks for your fabulous work at the law school.